Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here again. I love this venue. I get lots of good questions, which we will save time for at the end. This is an interesting occasion for me. This is actually the first time I've been up in front of an audience talking about Andrew Johnson. And forgive me if I say Jefferson occasionally. I had to write that when I was writing. I did a spell check to make sure that I didn't have Jefferson in there when I should have had Johnson, because the temptation was actually quite great. If somebody had told me a number of years ago, at any point in my life, that I would have written a book about Andrew Johnson, I would have told them they were crazy. It's not that I don't think he's an interesting person. He really is an interesting person, and not that I didn't know anything about him. But for most of my career as a historian, I've tried to avoid the period of Reconstruction. And it sounds strange for someone who writes about slavery, which is a difficult topic to write about. But I find it easier to deal with the 17th century and the 18th century and attitudes about race and slavery than I do dealing with Reconstruction. There's something about it that is just maddening to me. And I think what it is that it was a moment of opportunity. When I think of the people in the 17th and the 18th century who have very primitive ideas about many, many things in the world, and you know that there are just lots of things that they don't know, I can not totally forgive them, but it's not as irritating to me, exasperating to me, as a period of time when you have photographs, trains, things that are part of the modern era, and you feel closer to those people. The people in that time period, they seem more like us than someone in the 18th century or the 17th century when I'm writing about the development of slavery in Virginia or writing about Jefferson's Monticello even. So when I read about Reconstruction, in this moment of hope, it makes me angry. I'm able to be detached the further back you go, but that moment, it makes me really angry when I think about what could have happened and what did not happen and how close we were, how close the country was to a period of time when you really could have done something to begin the process of racial healing, the process of making America really one for everyone. So Johnson would not have been my topic of choice. I read about that era because I have to, but it wouldn't be something that I would never thought I would actually study it and actually write very much about it. But I got a phone call one morning from Arthur Schlesinger Jr. And telling me that I was going to be getting a letter from him and sort of talking just in general. And I did get this letter from him in which he asked me to write the biography of Andrew Johnson for the American President series, which is a very nice series of very short, concise books about American presidents. And they get people sort of, well, sometimes people who actually fit. Someone like Joyce Appleby did Thomas Jefferson. Of course, she is a great Jefferson scholar. But Gary Hart did a book. George McGuffin did Lincoln, I think. And so there's sort of a mix of historians and non-historians looking at these presidencies, telling the basic story, but also giving your own sort of individual spin on it. And he asked me to do this, to the Johnson book, and I guess he figured I would put my individual spin on it. I agreed to do it because Arthur asked me to do it, and I had great respect for him. I knew him from the papers of Thomas Jefferson. We were both on the advisory committee for that. And also because Paul Golub was the editor, who is also the general series editor for the series, was my editor for the book I did with Vernon Jordan. Vernon can read. So this was two friends, knew how it is when friends ask you to do things, who asked me to do this, and I said, sure. I put aside my misgivings. I knew it's a fascinating topic. There's so much material, very, very rich, but I wondered if I would be able to sort of curb my natural feelings of antipathy about looking at this particular period in American history, and I agreed to do it. And that was many, many years ago. This book is, I have to confess, long overdue. In between saying I would do that, I wrote The Hemmingses of Monticello, which took a lot of time and energy, and then I came back to this seriously and finished it, and I'm very, very glad that I did. So the first thing I had to do was to think about, how do I approach this? Now, Andrew Johnson is not known by lots of people. Not lots is known about him, but one thing people probably do know is that in almost every survey of rankings of American presidents, he is at the bottom. He's near the bottom. He's in the bottom 5. Since 1997, I've participated in these surveys, and sometimes I look at the results, sometimes I don't, but he's usually in the bottom 5. Buchanan is usually the worst, but he's in the bottom 5. This past year, when I didn't participate in the survey for the first time, I typically fill them out. I didn't this time because I was too busy. He made it to the last. He was considered the worst president. I said, just in time for the book, I could say. And in some surveys, he's considered one of the worst, and this year, the worst president. And once you get down at that point, it's really splitting hairs to think about what's the real story with that. But it's a difficult issue, because how do you sit down and write a book about somebody who's judged the worst of anything? Well, just because someone is the worst or near the worst doesn't mean that they're not important. And that's the first realization I had. This man was president at one of the most pivotal periods in American history, and there was a moment when the country could have gone one way or the other way, and he had a central role to play in that. And it came to me, it sort of hit me that it's very important to focus on the life of Andrew Johnson, because I really do believe that some of the decisions that he made during that time period affect us even today. And the choices he made, the choices he did not make, his attitude, his leadership style, all of those things help to make us who we are. And so for those reasons, you have to pay attention to him. And I say in the book that, history is not just about all the people you like, all the people you love and that you would love to have dinner with and spend time with or whatever. It's about people who did things that were important that help put us on the path to where we are now. And he is definitely a person who had that kind of, that role. So once I made my mind to do this and understood how to approach it, it was relatively easy to sort of sit down and get to work and try to tell his story in a way that would sort of illuminate what American life is like and what it was like during the time that Andrew Johnson lived. Now, Johnson is, well, different from Jefferson in many, many ways, but the first problem is that Johnson didn't learn to write until he was in his late teens. His wife, he married early, and his wife taught him how to write. In those days, reading and writing were different. Were separate, very separate things. There were many, many people who were taught to read so that they could read the Bible, but writing was not something that people thought necessarily went together. And so his parents were illiterate. Neither of his parents could read or write. That we know they couldn't write, because there's no, we have marks, we have no record of them writing, and people said that they were illiterate. And so he didn't become literate until he was a young man. And that poses a problem, because even though he learned to write, he was never very comfortable doing it. And at one point later on, he mentioned that he sort of hurt his arm, and that he sort of explained that as a reason he didn't write. But most people think it's because he was very, very self-conscious about it. And even in his writing, most of his life, he was self-conscious about it. So if you look at the papers of Andrew Johnson, there are many, many more letters to Andrew Johnson than Andrew Johnson to other people. So that poses a problem for a biographer right there. We don't have his inner voice. And with Jefferson, you have 18,000 letters that he wrote over the period of his life, and other kinds of documents and other things. And even though he remains an enigma to lots of people, there's still enough there to sort of craft some sense of what he's thinking, what he's feeling, and who he was. Johnson, you're at a disadvantage, because we don't really have that to the same extent. And the letters we have that show when he's a young man show lots of misspellings, lots of phonetic spellings of things, and it's difficult to wrap your mind, it was for me, difficult to wrap my mind around who he really was, because we just don't have the kind of record that you would typically have, not just leaving aside somebody like Jefferson, but other people who were presidents. It's just not there. So that's a big problem. And because we don't have lots of his letters, and there's not a huge repository of them or him explaining what he's doing, we don't have lots of stories about him.